I did not plan to spend that night in a cabin. I had not planned much at all when I left the small town of Redwater in northern Canada in early November of 2018. I just needed a break from work and noise and people. I told myself I would take the back roads, find a quiet place to hike, and clear my head. I packed light, too light if I am being honest. I carried a small backpack with a few protein bars, a cheap flashlight, a thin jacket, and my phone, which barely held a charge. I left early that morning, thinking I would be back before dark. That was my first mistake. I drove north for hours on dirt roads that grew smaller and thinner until they looked like narrow scars on the ground. I liked that feeling of being far from everything. The autumn trees were almost bare, and a few thin sheets of snow lay on the sides of the road. The air felt dry and sharp, and every breath filled my lungs with cold that woke me up more than any cup of coffee could. I reached a point where the road was blocked by a fallen tree. It was thin enough that I could move it, but I did not bother. I turned the engine off, stepped out, and decided to walk deeper into the woods. It was quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I moved slowly, following animal tracks in the mud, looking at broken branches, listening to birds that I could not see. Hours passed without me noticing. When I finally checked the time, the sun was already low. I did not know where my car was anymore. I had walked in too many small circles, taking turns without looking back. My phone had no signal. My cheap flashlight flickered when I tried it. The temperature dropped fast. I felt dumb and careless, but panic would not help me. I kept walking in what I believed was the right direction, trying to retrace steps that all looked the same. After another hour, the sky grew darker. The cold felt stronger now, slipping through the thin fabric of my jacket. My fingers were stiff, and every step made my boots feel heavier. I had to find shelter before the night swallowed the forest completely. The air smelled like wet soil and old wood. That was when I saw a shape between the trees, a square outline, a structure. At first I thought I imagined it, but the closer I got, the clearer it became. It was a small wooden cabin. The cabin looked abandoned. The wood was gray and cracked, and the metal roof was rusted. A pile of old firewood sat beside the door, covered in dry leaves. The windows were dusty and dark. I walked around it first, making sure no one lived there. I could see no car, no tracks, nothing. The door was slightly open. The inside was cold and smelled like dust and old smoke. Still, it was shelter, and shelter meant survival. The first thing I saw inside was a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress that looked hard as stone. A small table sat in one corner with a metal cup on top. The fireplace was filled with old ash. There was a cracked mirror on the wall, and my reflection looked pale and tired under the dim light of the sunset. The place looked like no one had been there for years. I set my backpack down and searched for dry wood. I needed fire. The cabin had no electricity. The darkness outside was growing too fast. I gathered small pieces of wood from the corner, rubbed dust off them, and used an old lighter I found in one of the drawers. The flame caught slow at first, but then the fire grew, breathing warmth back into the cold room. I sat close to it, stretching my numb fingers toward the heat. For the first few minutes, I felt safe. Then I started to notice the small things that made my skin crawl. The cabin had no footprints around it except mine, yet inside the floor looked cleaner in some spots, as if someone had walked there not long ago. The air carried a faint smell that did not belong to wood or ash. It smelled like sweat and old clothes. I convinced myself it was from the mattress or maybe from an animal that used the place to hide. But the uneasiness stayed. As the fire warmed the room, I decided to check the windows. I wiped the dust from the closest one with my sleeve. The sky outside was black now, with only the faintest silver glow from the moon. The trees stood together in a dark wall. I could not see far. My breath fogged the glass each time I exhaled. I noticed something on the ground outside, a a set of footprints in the thin layer of snow. They were fresh, so fresh that they looked made within the hour. They were not mine. They came from the path between the trees and stopped right under the window. No prints walked away. It looked like someone had stood there, watching the cabin, watching me, and then disappeared without walking back. I felt pressure in my chest and a cold, tight feeling in my stomach. I moved back from the window slowly and sat near the fire, listening. The woods outside were too quiet, quieter than before. I tried to tell myself the prints were old, maybe from earlier that morning, and the snow had not melted. But deep down I knew that was not true. Time passed painfully slow. The fire cracked softly. The cabin felt smaller with every minute. I kept glancing toward the door, waiting for the slightest sound. My heart would jump each time the wind brushed against the roof. I wished I had something heavier than a metal cup to defend myself. Then I heard it. Not wind, not an animal. A soft, slow pressure on the snow outside. A careful step. Then another, and another. Someone was walking around the cabin. I froze. I tried not to breathe too loud. I listened so hard that my ears felt sharp. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, controlled. They circled the cabin once. Then they stopped right outside the door. The wood of the door made a faint creaking sound, like pressure resting against it. My throat felt dry. The cabin felt too open, too weak. A single push would break the door. For a long moment, nothing happened. I stared at the door, waiting for it to move, waiting for the handle to turn. But it did not. The pressure vanished. No more steps. No sound at all. I waited almost an hour before I moved again. I pushed the small table quietly against the door. The cabin felt too cold again, even with the fire burning strong. I sat with my back against the wall, keeping my eyes on the door until exhaustion finally forced me to sleep. When I woke up, the fire was almost gone, and daylight was leaking through the cracks in the walls. My body felt stiff and my neck hurt from sleeping against the wall. The first thing I did was check the door. The table was still there. The door was closed, but when I opened it, I saw new footprints on the snow. They led from the woods, stopped at the door, and then walked away toward the deeper part of the forest. Someone had come back during the night. My fear turned into something like adrenaline. I grabbed my backpack, stepped outside, and followed the snowy ground back the way I believed I had come. Daylight helped me find landmarks I remembered. A fallen birch tree, a broken fence, a rocky hill. After 2 hours of walking, I finally spotted my car in the distance. Relief washed through me so fast it almost knocked me down. I looked back once before driving away. The cabin was hidden behind the trees, but I could still picture the footprints, the door, the silent steps in the dark. I knew I had not imagined any of it. Someone had been out there watching, someone living in the woods or passing through, someone who knew the forest better than I did. I left the place behind, but even now, years later, I can still feel that cold pressure on the other side of the door, the kind of presence that does not need to speak or move to make itself known. The ending of it all is simple and real. I survived because I left before the sun went down again. I survived because daylight showed me a way back. I never reported anything, because there was nothing to report except footprints and fear. I never returned to that part of the forest again. The cabin is probably still there, hidden in the trees, waiting for the next person who thinks they are alone. And I know now, without any doubt, that empty places are rarely as empty as they seem. It was the summer of 2019 when I found myself driving down a narrow, winding road in northern Vermont, far from the highway and any sense of civilization. I hadn't been back to this area since my divorce 3 years prior, and yet, there I was, approaching a cabin I had only seen once before. My ex-husband's family cabin, tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place that seemed permanently stitched into the forest around it. The GPS had long since given up, so I relied on the old directions he'd scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper years ago. I didn't expect to go inside, but something about that cabin had always unsettled me. Now, with him gone from my life entirely, I felt a strange pull, a mix of fear and curiosity. The road narrowed further as I climbed. The trees on either side formed a tight tunnel of green, blocking the sky and making the world feel smaller. The sunlight filtered in patches, highlighting the dust and small stones on the uneven dirt road. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter as I turned the last corner. There it was, the cabin. Weathered gray wood, moss growing in patches on the roof, a single stone chimney leaning slightly to one side. The front porch sagged under the weight of time, and the windows, clouded with age and dirt, seemed to watch me as I approached. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with the faint aroma of pine and something else, something decaying. I parked a few yards from the cabin, my truck tires sinking slightly into the soft soil. As I stepped out, the ground felt spongy underfoot, and I could hear the hum of insects, the occasional bird, and the whisper of wind through the trees. It was eerily quiet in a way that made every sound feel amplified. The forest was dense here, dark and close. I walked up to the porch and ran my hand over the railing, which was rough and splintered. It shook slightly under my fingers. I didn't plan to stay long, but a compulsion made me push the creaking door open. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with the smell of old wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic. Dust floated in beams of sunlight from the cracked windows. I stepped carefully over the threshold, my boots crunching softly on the uneven floorboards. The living room was empty except for a few pieces of furniture covered in yellowed sheets. I noticed a large, cracked stone fireplace and the remnants of what looked like a long-abandoned fire. Everything was coated in a layer of neglect. A forgotten coffee mug on a side table, a newspaper from years ago, the remnants of a calendar stuck to the wall. I moved through the cabin slowly, exploring the rooms I remembered from that brief visit years ago. The kitchen still smelled faintly of grease and rot. The sink had a layer of grime, and the cupboards were warped and sagging. I opened one cautiously and found empty, dusty cans, some rusty, some with labels peeling. There was a half-empty bottle of dish soap that had turned an opaque white, and the floor was sticky under my boots. The hallway led to 2 bedrooms. I paused at the first door. It creaked loudly when I pushed it open, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. An old quilt covered the bed, faded and torn. There were clothes scattered across the floor, moth-eaten and stiff. A dresser leaned dangerously to one side, drawers slightly ajar, with clothes spilling out like they had been abandoned in a hurry. In the corner, a suitcase stood upright, closed, but the latch was rusted and fragile. I walked to the second bedroom, the one that had always felt like his personal space. The air was cooler here, heavier. There were faint stains on the carpet, and I could see what looked like the imprint of furniture that had been moved years ago. My foot brushed against something solid, and I looked down to find an old wooden box. It was locked with a simple latch, corroded and stiff, but I managed to pry it open. Inside were papers, letters, a few faded photographs. Most of them were mundane. Bills, notes, receipts, but a few were unexpected. Sketches of the cabin, the surrounding forest, strange markings I didn't recognize, maps with excess drawn in corners. I felt a chill as I held them. The meticulous detail in some of the sketches suggested someone had been obsessed, maybe even paranoid, about this place. I left the box on the floor and moved to the back of the cabin. A narrow door led outside to a small, overgrown yard. The forest pressed in from all sides, dark and thick. I noticed a trail, faint and barely visible, leading down a slope into the woods. Something about the trail made my stomach tighten. It wasn't natural, it had been made intentionally, cleared in some way, but it hadn't been used in years. I followed it cautiously, listening to the cracking twigs under my boots and the distant sound of birds. After a few minutes, I came to a clearing, roughly circular, where the grass had been flattened, almost as if something large had rested there for a long time. I felt a sudden awareness of being watched. There was no one there, but the silence pressed on me, almost like the forest itself was breathing. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, the trees, the undergrowth. That's when I noticed it, a figure, or rather, the suggestion of a figure hidden behind a large pine. I froze. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound, but my heart hammered in my chest, and I felt the cold rush of fear. Instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't move immediately. I stepped back, slowly, my eyes fixed on that dark patch behind the tree. It could have been a trick of the light, a shadow, my imagination running wild after years of avoidance. Yet, the sense of unease persisted, heavy and real. I retraced my steps to the cabin, my hands brushing against the railing, the wood warm in the afternoon sun but rough under my fingers. Once inside, I closed and locked the door behind me. I took a deep breath, leaning against the wall, letting the tension drain slowly from my body. The cabin was empty, silent, yet filled with the weight of the past. It was strange, realizing that all the fear I'd ever felt in that marriage, all the control and manipulation, had left its mark not just on me, but on the very space itself. This cabin, abandoned, decaying, carried those memories like an imprint in the wood and stone. I spent the next hour exploring more thoroughly, moving slowly, taking note of details I had never noticed before. The ceiling beams were cracked, the floorboards uneven. In the corner of the living room, a small trapdoor led to a basement I hadn't known existed. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The steps groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The air was damp, cold, and smelled of mold and soil. There were shelves with jars, most broken, some intact, filled with things I couldn't immediately identify: dried plants, rusty tools, a few old cans. In the corner, a mound of dirt suggested some unfinished project, or perhaps just a long abandoned one. I shined my flashlight around, noting every detail: the rough stone walls, the exposed pipes, the spider webs hanging in corners. After a while, I climbed back to the main floor. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the grimy windows. I realized it was time to leave. I walked back to the truck slowly, glancing once more at the cabin. It sat quietly, almost serene, in the fading light, but I could feel the weight of history and tension clinging to it. Driving away, the forest seemed to close behind me, the road twisting and turning until the cabin was nothing more than a memory through the windshield. By the time I reached the highway, the unease had lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of closure. I had faced the cabin, the space that held echoes of my past, and left intact, unharmed, and aware. That place wasn't haunted by anything supernatural. It was haunted by human history, by fear and obsession, by life lived in extremes. And by leaving, by observing and acknowledging, I realized I could finally let go of the residue of my own fear and anger. I had confronted the place, and in doing so, I felt lighter, as if a shadow I hadn't known I carried was finally released. I never imagined I'd find myself alone in the middle of northern Minnesota in November, trapped in a cabin that felt like it had been left to rot for decades. My name is Claire, I'm 28, and I had convinced myself that a solo weekend away from the city would clear my head. I'd just come out of a messy breakup. My apartment smelled faintly of cheap wine and leftover takeout, and I needed space. Space that felt untouched, even a little wild. I found the cabin through a local rental site. The pictures made it look rustic and charming. A small wooden structure tucked among pine trees, smoke curling lazily from a chimney, frost glinting on the windows. The drive itself was exhausting. The highway ended abruptly, giving way to a thin, unpaved road that twisted through dense forest. By the time I turned the last corner, a dull orange sunset had fallen behind the trees, leaving long shadows across the snow-flecked path. I could barely make out the cabin through the dark, the wooden boards looking rough, almost angry. The front porch sagged slightly, and the railing looked like it hadn't been maintained for years. I stepped inside, and the air was cold and heavy, smelling faintly of mildew and old wood. The floorboards creaked under my boots. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a few stacked logs next to it, and a tiny kitchen that hadn't been touched in months, maybe years. Dust coated the counters. I shrugged off my coat, set down my backpack, and lit the stove. The fire didn't catch right away. I had to rearrange the kindling several times before the flames licked the iron stove door and spread warmth across the room. As the cabin warmed, I explored cautiously. There was a small bedroom with a single bed and a wool blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs. A thin layer of frost had crept along the edges of the window pane. I stacked some more wood next to the stove and sank into the bed to catch my breath. The silence was oppressive. Not just the absence of people, but the deep, almost physical presence of the forest pressing against the walls. The wind outside rattled the eaves, and the trees groaned under the weight of snow. That first night was restless. Every small noise made me jump. The snap of a branch outside, the scurry of something tiny across the floorboards, the distant howl of a wolf or a coyote. I kept checking the locks even though the doors were solid old oak. Sleep came only in short bursts, fractured by the sensation that something was moving just beyond the shadows of the cabin. I told myself it was just the forest, that I had wanted this, that I was being dramatic. The next day, I decided to go outside, hoping that movement would clear my mind. Snow had fallen overnight, thick and powdery. The forest looked beautiful in the sunlight, but every tree looked like it could hide something. I wandered the perimeter of the cabin, crunching through snow, and I found what disturbed me. Footprints. Human footprints, leading from the tree line to the cabin. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. Panic bubbled in my chest. I retraced my steps around the cabin. The footprints ended abruptly in the woods. Whoever had left them had vanished into the trees. I told myself I wasn't in danger. People live out here, it's normal. Hunters, hikers, neighbors. But a sense of being watched never left me. I started keeping the axe from the corner of the cabin close by. The shadows outside seemed to lengthen and move, even when the sun was high. By the third night, my nerves were fraying. I was exhausted, my body stiff from the cold, my mind spiraling. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave. I kept my flashlight on while I moved around the cabin, double-checked the locks, even barricaded the door a little with a chair. Around midnight, the noises started. At first, it was soft, a tap on the window like a finger tracing the glass, then a low scratching on the door. My heart thumped so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I just watched the shadows shift through the window, flickers of movement in the dark. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the snow was deep, and I didn't know where I would go. Hours passed. The tapping stopped. The scratching stopped. I eventually fell asleep sitting upright in the chair, the axe across my lap. When I woke, the sun was just peeking over the treetops, the forest calm again. I thought maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks. I laughed bitterly at myself. I spent the morning preparing to leave. I bundled my things, made a small fire to warm the cabin in case the owner came by, and double-checked that nothing looked out of place. That's when I found it. A small stack of sticks leaning against the back wall, neatly arranged, almost like someone had been inside while I slept. My blood ran cold. No footprints, no sign anyone had walked in. They must have crawled or used some other method. I packed faster. I left the cabin without a second glance at the windows or the trees. My car was half buried in snow, but I managed to start it and drive back down the narrow road. As I rounded the first bend, I looked back. The cabin sat among the trees, silent, unassuming. From a distance, it could have been picturesque, but I knew what I had felt, the long hours of being watched, the small hints that someone had been closer than I realized. By the time I reached the highway and civilization, I was shaking. My phone signal returned, and I called the local sheriff's office, reporting the incident. They said they would check on the property, but I never heard anything about trespassers or squatters. I didn't care. Weeks later, I returned to the city, my apartment smelling faintly of cleaning supplies instead of wine. I kept the experience to myself, telling only a friend that the cabin had been a little creepy, but not why. Changed me. I understood the weight of solitude in the wrong place, the tension of isolation, and the sharp edge of fear that isn't imagined but entirely real. I learned that wilderness can be dangerous not because of wild animals or the cold, but because of people, others who can move silently without warning while you think you are alone. I don't go to cabins alone anymore. I stick to crowded trails, rented rooms with neighbors, or anywhere people are nearby. The thought of that cabin, the long nights and shadows, stays with me. It's not a memory of ghosts or fairy tales, but of the tangible, human fear that comes when you realize the world is bigger, stranger, and more unpredictable than you think. And that, more than anything, is scarier than any story. I hadn't planned to stay in the countryside that weekend, but I needed a break from the city. The constant noise, the crowded streets, the endless deadlines. Everything was suffocating. So, I found this small cabin for rent in northern Vermont, tucked away near a dense patch of woods by a shallow river. The listing made it sound cozy. A simple wooden cabin with a fireplace, a small porch, and a few acres of open land. The year was 2013, I was 29, and for once, the thought of complete isolation felt like a relief. The drive up was longer than I expected. My old Ford struggled up the winding roads, the tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen leaves. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already dipping behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields. The cabin was smaller than I imagined, nothing more than a square wooden box with a steep roof and a single chimney. The paint was faded, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle, but it had charm. A pile of firewood leaned against one side, and the faint smell of pine lingered in the air. I parked, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The floorboards creaked under my weight. My dog, Max, a German Shepherd mix, leapt out of the car with a low growl of excitement, sniffing every corner. I unlocked the cabin and pushed the door open. The inside was dim, the sun already fading, leaving the room in a dull golden glow. Dust motes floated in the air, dancing in the weak light. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a wood-burning stove, and a living space with a sagging sofa and a few shelves of old books. I set my bag down and Max immediately ran to the window, tail wagging, ears alert. I decided to start a fire. The wood was dry and smelled faintly of smoke. I stacked it carefully, struck a match, and watched as the flames came alive, filling the cabin with warmth and the faint smell of burning pine. Outside, the wind had picked up. It rustled the leaves and made the old trees sway, their branches scraping against each other like dry bones. Max's ears perked up at every sound. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Night fell quickly. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind that presses against windows and makes you feel smaller, as though the world itself is closing in. I made some coffee, sat on the sofa, and tried to read one of the old books from the shelf, but the words blurred together. Every so often, I would hear a snapping branch outside, and Max would growl low and cautious. I kept telling myself it was just deer, maybe a raccoon, but the feeling wouldn't leave me. Around 10, I decided to check the doors and windows. Everything was locked, the latches tight. Max followed me from room to room, his body tense. Then I noticed something odd. There were faint footprints in the thin layer of dirt on the porch. Not my own, and they didn't match Max's paw prints. They were human, small, like someone had been crouching or moving carefully. My stomach sank. I hadn't seen anyone else on the property, and the nearest road was a 20-minute walk through the woods. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe a neighbor's kid had wandered over earlier. I tried to calm myself, pouring another cup of coffee. But then I heard it. A low, dragging sound outside, like someone was moving a heavy object across the gravel. Max stiffened, hackles raised, teeth bared. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat from behind the door and crept to the window, pressing my forehead against the glass. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. But then, a shadow passed, quick and deliberate, along the edge of the clearing. Someone had to be out there. My pulse was racing. I considered calling the local sheriff, but my phone barely had a signal, and I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town. I decided to wait it out, sitting by the fire with Max close to me, every nerve taut. Hours passed like this. The sounds of the night, rustling leaves, snapping branches, the river gurgling nearby, felt amplified in the dark. Every small noise made me jump. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, this time closer. A deliberate scraping at the side of the cabin, like fingernails or a metal object against the wood. Max barked furiously, running to the door. I shouted, hoping the sound would scare whoever it was away, but it stopped abruptly. Silence fell thick and heavy. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire dwindling to embers. By dawn, exhaustion had settled over me, but I refused to sleep. The woods outside were calm, birds beginning their morning chorus, but the unease lingered. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, refusing to leave anything behind, and led Max to the car. As I started the engine, I noticed something on the porch again. A small, carved wooden figure, crude and freshly made, had been placed near the steps. I hadn't seen it before. My stomach churned. It wasn't threatening in itself, just deliberate. Someone had been close enough to put it there while I slept. Someone who had watched the cabin, maybe for hours. I didn't wait to analyze it. I drove off immediately, Max's panting loud in the car, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The drive back was tense. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but the road was empty. When I finally reached a gas station on the main road, I pulled in, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, explaining the footprints, the sounds, the figure. They said they'd send someone to check the cabin, but I didn't stay to wait. A week later, I received a call. The sheriff told me they had found evidence of someone living in the woods nearby. A small campsite with tools, food, and crude handmade items like the figure I had seen. Apparently, the person had been watching the cabin for months, moving around silently, careful not to be seen. The authorities never found the individual, and the campsite was abandoned when they arrived. I never went back. The cabin listing was eventually removed. I still think about that night sometimes. The isolation, the silence, the feeling that someone was always just outside, waiting. It changed the way I looked at being alone in nature. The countryside can be peaceful, yes, but it can also be quietly terrifying when you realize you are not truly alone. And Max, even years later, still flinches at the sound of a branch snapping, as if he remembers that night too. I learned something from that experience. Safety is relative. You can prepare, lock doors, watch every shadow, but there's always someone, somewhere, observing. And sometimes the fear isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about real people, real intentions, and the realization that the world outside your small, secure bubble doesn't care whether you feel safe or not. That cabin, those woods, they left a mark on me that I will never forget. It was the late fall of 1997 when I found myself driving down a stretch of road I had never seen before. The air was already biting, with frost clinging stubbornly to the edges of the windshield, and the clouds hung low, heavy with the threat of snow. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of college and trying to figure out what to do with my life, carrying a restless curiosity that often led me to places people avoided. That day, I hadn't planned to end up at the place I did. I was simply following an old map I had found in the back of my father's study. It was a crude, hand-drawn thing, labeling a small, abandoned cabin somewhere near the edge of an old, forgotten graveyard in rural Vermont. The road turned into nothing more than a muddy track, flanked by dense woods on both sides. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky. A cold wind rattled the car doors as I slowed down to a crawl. The GPS on my car didn't recognize this area, which made the journey feel even more isolated. I hadn't seen another car for over an hour, and the occasional crow or distant rustle of leaves was the only sign of life. After what felt like an eternity, the trees parted, revealing a clearing. There it stood, partially hidden behind a crumbling stone wall. The cabin. It was small, with weathered wooden walls streaked with gray and black from years of exposure. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dark, some missing panes of glass, others smeared with dirt. But what made the place more unnerving was its proximity to the graveyard. Beyond the cabin, I could see dozens of gravestones, most leaning at strange angles, their inscriptions worn away by time. Some were cracked, others had fallen entirely, leaving the earth around them disturbed and uneven. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing, my stomach twisting with a mixture of excitement and unease. Stepping out, I noticed the air was thicker here, almost damp, carrying the earthy, musty scent of decaying leaves and old soil. I walked toward the cabin, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. Each step seemed louder than it should have been. I reached the front door, which was barely hanging on its hinges. I pushed it gently, and it groaned, echoing in the empty space inside. The interior was sparse. Dust coated every surface, and the wooden floorboards creaked under my weight. A small stove sat in one corner, rusted and long unused, and a table leaned slightly to one side. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners, and the faint smell of mold permeated the room. I ran my hand along the wall and felt the rough texture of splintered wood. I could tell this place hadn't been lived in for decades. Curiosity drew me further in. There was a small loft at the back, accessible by a rickety ladder. I climbed it cautiously, each step groaning under my weight. The loft wasn't large, just enough room for a single mattress or a cot. Now gone. Dust particles floated in the shafts of light coming through the broken windows, giving the space an almost surreal quality. I leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Despite the cabin's decay, it had a certain stillness, an eerie calm that made my skin prickle. After exploring, I decided to step outside again. The graveyard caught my attention more and more. I wandered among the gravestones, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. Many of the markers were old, dating back to the 1800s, their engravings nearly impossible to read. Some had names, dates, and short epitaphs, while others were simple, unadorned stones. The wind moved through the clearing, rattling dry leaves and sending an occasional crow cawing overhead. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, though I knew logically that I was alone. As the day waned, the sun dipped behind the horizon, and the sky turned a bruised shade of purple. Shadows stretched across the graveyard, elongating the already disturbing shapes of the gravestones. I realized I had stayed longer than I intended, and the thought of night settling in this isolated place made my stomach tighten. I turned to head back to the cabin when I noticed something. One of the gravestones, a simple stone with no discernible name, seemed to have been disturbed. The earth around it was freshly turned, and I could see the imprint of something heavy having been removed or buried. My heart started to pound, and I took a step back. The thought that someone had been here recently, perhaps even living nearby, made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had overreacted, that animals or natural erosion could explain the disturbed grave. But the unease lingered. The wind whistled through the broken windows, and shadows played tricks on my eyes. I decided to make a fire in the old stove to warm up, using some dry wood I had found stacked in a corner. The flames flickered and cast long, wavering shadows across the cabin walls. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, listening. The creaks of the cabin were constant, and every gust of wind made the place groan as though it were alive. Night deepened, and the temperature dropped sharply. I wrapped myself in the only blanket I could find and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. I kept imagining figures moving just beyond the windows, shadows stretching unnaturally among the gravestones. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, but when I looked, there was nothing. Hours passed like this, each minute heavier than the last, until finally, exhaustion claimed me. I woke to the first pale light of morning, weak and gray. The cold had seeped into my bones, and the unease of the previous night hadn't entirely left me. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my few things, double-checked the cabin, and stepped outside. The clearing looked different in daylight, less menacing, but the disturbed grave still caught my eye. I took one last look at the cabin and graveyard before heading back down the muddy track toward the main road. The drive back was quiet. The sun slowly burned away the frost and lifted the oppressive weight of night. By the time I reached a small town several miles away, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though leaving that clearing behind had lifted a burden. I never went back to that cabin, and the map I had used disappeared somewhere between my car and my apartment. Looking back, I realized the experience had left me changed. It wasn't about ghosts or supernatural forces. It was about isolation, decay, and the weight of time pressing down on forgotten places. The cabin and graveyard were reminders that some spaces are better left undisturbed, that there's an unspoken tension in places that history has claimed but people have abandoned. And though I left physically unharmed, the memory stayed with me. The cold wind, the disturbed grave, the creaking wood, and the feeling of being watched, all wrapped in the quiet, relentless persistence of a place long forgotten. I never told anyone exactly where I went. Some things are best left as private warnings, whispered to yourself in the middle of a warm, crowded room. That cabin, that graveyard, they exist somewhere in Vermont, quietly waiting for the next curious soul to wander down that muddy track, step inside, and feel the weight of a place the world forgot. And maybe, just maybe, you'd understand why it was best to leave it that way. I first saw the cabin during the late fall of 1987, when I was 22 and desperate for a quiet place to get away from the city. I had grown up in Kansas City, used to the constant hum of traffic and the dim orange glow of streetlights, but I had spent the last few years working in construction, and the noise had started to feel suffocating. When I found the old farm cabin in northeastern Missouri, I thought it was perfect. It wasn't much, just a small, weathered structure with peeling paint, a sagging roof, and a few outbuildings scattered across the acres of overgrown fields. But the price was low, and the isolation promised peace. The drive there had been long. I remember the winding roads, the dense clusters of oaks and maples, and the way the late afternoon sunlight slanted across the fields like dusted gold. I arrived when the sky was a dull shade of gray, the wind starting to pick up from the northeast. The cabin sat on a slight rise, half hidden by a grove of cottonwoods. The yard was littered with rusted farm equipment and broken fences, and the smell of damp earth and rotting leaves hit me the moment I opened the truck door. It was raw and earthy, a smell I had almost forgotten. I parked and stepped out, listening to the emptiness. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional caw of a crow. I spent the first day just exploring the property. There was a small chicken coop that had long been abandoned, a dilapidated barn with a roof full of holes, and a pond at the edge of the property that was half overgrown with weeds. The cabin itself was simple: one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and a bathroom that hadn't been touched in years. The floors creaked, the windows rattled when the wind hit them, and the walls had water stains that made me wonder if the roof had ever been properly sealed. But I liked it. There was a rough charm to it, and I had come prepared with tools, a chainsaw, and a few weeks' worth of food. That first night, the wind really picked up. I had stacked wood for the stove and built a small fire, the light casting long shadows across the cracked walls. Every now and then, the wind would push the cabin slightly, groaning in protest. I told myself it was normal, old buildings do that. But around midnight, when the wind died down for a moment, I heard it, a low scraping sound coming from the back of the cabin. At first, I thought it was the wind again, maybe dragging a branch across the wall, but it kept repeating, slow and deliberate. I grabbed a flashlight and crept outside, circling the back of the cabin, but the yard was empty. Nothing moved. The moon was bright enough that I could see the outline of the trees and the broken fence posts, but there was no animal, no person, nothing. Just emptiness. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I chopped firewood, checked the fences, and explored further into the fields. I noticed tire tracks near the pond that weren't mine, shallow impressions in the mud, old but distinct. It wasn't unusual. People sometimes drove across abandoned land, but it made me uneasy. That night, I slept with the door locked, a baseball bat across the bed. The wind came again, this time carrying a faint metallic scent. I thought it was the barn, maybe some old machinery rusting. It didn't take long for things to escalate. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy, deliberate steps. I froze, heart hammering. The cabin door was still locked, the windows closed. The footsteps stopped, then started again, pacing back and forth. I stayed perfectly still, listening. They finally went away, but I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I found the door to the chicken coop swung open. Nothing was inside, but the latch was broken. Whoever or whatever had been outside had been close. The next week was tense. I began checking the perimeter constantly, barricading the doors with extra pieces of wood, reinforcing the windows with nails and boards I found in the barn. I even set traps near the edges of the property. Simple snares, nothing dangerous, just enough to know if someone was coming. But nothing worked. At night, I would hear rustling in the tall grass, distant thumps from the barn, and always that faint scraping sound from the back of the cabin. Then one night I caught a glimpse of him. I was standing by the stove, the cabin lit by firelight, when a shadow moved across the kitchen window. I froze. The figure was tall, wearing a hooded jacket, standing just beyond the tree line. For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then he turned and vanished into the night. I didn't follow, couldn't. I spent hours peering into the darkness, trying to find where he had gone. But it was useless. The fields were endless, the trees thick, and the wind muffled sound. I knew then that I wasn't alone. This wasn't a prank, this wasn't a wildlife issue. Someone was watching, someone who knew the property better than I did. My sleep suffered, my hands shook while chopping wood, and even simple tasks like hauling water from the well became tense operations. I felt trapped, as if the land itself was conspiring against me. One evening, after a particularly tense day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I walked past the pond, past the barn, and up the small hill behind the cabin. That's when I found something that froze me completely. In the dirt, near the tree line, were fresh tire tracks, deep and wide, like a truck had driven right across the field. And in the mud, I noticed something else. Footprints. Large, booted prints, heavy and deliberate, circling around the back of the cabin, leading back into the woods. Whoever had been out there had spent hours pacing, watching. I returned to the cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, I didn't even try to light the stove. I slept fully clothed, bat and knife within reach, flashlight at the side of the bed. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of something hammering against the side of the cabin. Not wood, not metal, something heavy, deliberate. I grabbed the bat, yanked open the door, and ran into the yard. The wind had shifted, and I realized the barn door was wide open. Someone had been inside, had been hiding there while I slept. That morning, I didn't wait. I packed what I could in the truck, the food, the tools, the clothes, and I drove straight into town. I didn't look back. Later, I learned from the local sheriff that the property had a history. Years before, it had been used by a man who disappeared suddenly, leaving the cabin to fall into disrepair. Neighbors had reported strange figures, vehicles at night, but no one had ever caught anything in the act. I never returned to that cabin. I sold it eventually at a loss just to be rid of it. But even years later, I can still remember the wind whistling through the broken trees, the scraping sound at the back of the cabin, the sense of being watched from the shadows. It wasn't ghosts, it wasn't anything supernatural. It was just someone, somewhere, hiding and waiting in the emptiness. And I had been completely alone and vulnerable in a place that felt like it should have been safe. Even now, when I'm driving through rural areas, I catch myself scanning the tree lines, listening for footsteps in the dark, remembering how easy it is for someone to disappear into a field of shadows and silence. And I know I'll never make the mistake of thinking a quiet, isolated place is automatically safe again. I never thought a short trip to the Scottish Highlands could turn into one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It was the winter of 2016, and I was 28, desperate to escape the noise of Glasgow for a few days. I had rented a small cabin through an online listing that promised solitude, comfort, and a view of the surrounding forest. I didn't want company. I wanted silence, snow, and the smell of wood smoke drifting through a cold, empty cabin. The journey itself was beautiful, in a quiet, haunting kind of way. The road narrowed into a twisting path lined by ancient oaks and pines dusted with frost. I remember the way the snow crunched under my tires and how the low winter sun made everything look silver and pale. By the time I reached the cabin, I was shivering from more than just the cold. There was a strange thrill in the emptiness surrounding the place, as if the forest had swallowed every sound from the outside world. The cabin was small, wooden, and far older than the photos suggested, with a sagging roof and a tiny stone chimney that hadn't seen use in years. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a smell of damp pine and dust hit me immediately. I had expected a little mustiness in a cabin this remote, but it was stronger than I anticipated, and I felt a twinge of unease. Still, I shrugged it off. I unpacked my small bag, laid out some blankets on the old bed, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was immediate and welcome, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Night fell fast. In the highlands, the sun seems to vanish like a door closing, leaving the world in dim blue light. I sat in front of the fire with a notebook, planning to write down some thoughts, maybe even a story or two. That's when I first noticed her. I hadn't seen anyone approaching. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a shadow cast by a tree that the firelight made dance on the wall. But then she stepped closer. She was thin, almost skeletal in appearance, with long dark hair that fell in greasy strands over her face. Her clothes were ragged and soaked from the snow, and her eyes, dark and wide, seemed to fixate on me with an intensity one couldn't understand. She didn't knock. She didn't speak. She just stood there, inches from the door, staring. My first instinct was fear, the primal kind that freezes your body and makes your mind scramble for explanations. I remember my stomach turning cold, my hands gripping the fire poker like it was the only thing keeping me alive. I wanted to scream, but the sound felt useless in the vast, empty forest. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to back away slowly. My eyes never left hers. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. And then, almost casually, she turned and vanished into the trees as though she had been part of the shadows all along. I waited for a long time, expecting her to return, but all that remained was the sound of snow falling and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. The next morning, I told myself it had been a trick of the light or exhaustion. I made breakfast, chopped some firewood, and tried to shake the lingering unease. But the sense that I wasn't alone never left me. Every sound outside, the wind rattling branches, a distant caw of a crow, made my heart jump. I avoided the windows and tried to convince myself that the figure I had seen was just another hiker or, more likely, someone lost in the woods. By the second night, the tension had grown unbearable. I was restless, pacing the cabin, checking the locks again and again. Then I saw her again. This time, she was at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight spilling from the doorway. Her posture hadn't changed. She wasn't running, waving, or even breathing visibly. She was just watching. Something about her presence was different this time. I couldn't explain why, but it wasn't a random appearance. It felt deliberate, calculated. I knew instinctively that I had to leave. My car was parked a short walk down the trail, but the snow had turned into a heavy flurry, and visibility was dropping fast. Every step toward my car was tense, my ears straining for any sound of movement behind me. When I finally reached it, I kept looking over my shoulder. She hadn't moved. She hadn't followed. I drove without stopping, the car's headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Even with the heater on full, my fingers were numb, my mouth dry. I tried to convince myself I would feel better once I reached the nearest village, a small town called Ballater. But a part of me remained certain that she had been following the cabin, waiting, studying. In Ballater, I stopped at a petrol station and told the clerk I'd seen someone wandering in the woods. He looked at me oddly but asked a few questions. "People have been disappearing up that way," he said casually, as though it were nothing unusual. "Some just don't turn up, especially around old cabins. You're lucky it's only been a scare." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. I paid and left, feeling a mix of relief and residual terror. I never went back to that cabin. Months later, I learned through a local news article that the area had a history of squatters and homeless people sheltering in abandoned buildings. Some had a reputation for being unpredictable. No one knew exactly who the woman had been or why she had been there, but it explained enough. She wasn't supernatural. She wasn't a ghost. She was human, and sometimes the reality of human unpredictability is far scarier than anything imagined. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see her silhouette against the snow, frozen in that moment of stillness. I remember the way the wind seemed to hesitate around her, the way the firelight made her hair glint. Most of all, I remember the lesson I learned in that quiet, isolated cabin. Solitude in the wilderness can feel safe and serene, but it can also make you profoundly aware of how vulnerable you truly are. I still go hiking, still visit remote places, but I've never stayed in a cabin like that again. I make sure someone knows where I am. I stay close to the road, and I always keep a charged phone in my pocket. And while it's comforting to tell myself that she was just a person in need, part of me knows that her sudden, silent presence was a reminder of how unpredictable the world can be when you're alone. That winter in the Highlands taught me to respect the isolation, to be cautious, and to remember that sometimes the scariest things are just ordinary people who move silently in the shadows. The memory isn't just a story anymore. It's a warning, engraved with every detail. The smell of the snow, the creak of the cabin floorboards, the cold, dark eyes of a woman who appeared and vanished like she had always been part of the forest. And for that reason, it never truly leaves me. I didn't plan on stopping near that old cabin. I had only meant to cut across the back roads of northern Minnesota to save myself some time on a long drive home in late October of 2017. I was 28 then, working long shifts at a job that drained me, and I wanted a quiet weekend without noise or people. I thought the forest roads would help calm my head. The air was cold, and thin patches of snow clung to the shaded parts of the pines. I liked the stillness at first. It felt cleaner than the buzzing towns I had been passing through. About an hour into the drive, my truck started making a dull knocking sound. I tried to ignore it, but the noise spread through the floor and up my legs, shaking in a way that told me something wasn't right. When the temperature gauge began climbing higher than normal, I pulled over on a dirt shoulder where the forest thickened around me. I shut off the engine and stepped into the cold air, which bit through my jacket harder than I expected. The woods around me were quiet in a deep, heavy way, like everything was holding its breath. I walked around to the front and lifted the hood. Steam drifted out, white and faint, and I smelled something burnt that made my gut tighten. I didn't want to stand out there in the cold, but I also didn't want to keep the engine running. I checked my phone and saw I had no signal. The nearest highway was miles back, and the light was fading fast. It was late afternoon but looked closer to evening with how thick the clouds hung over the treetops. I remembered noticing a dirt trail branching off the road a few minutes before the truck started acting up. I didn't know where it went, but I figured there might be a ranger shed or hunting place nearby. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and started walking back down the road. My boots sank into wet leaves, making soft crunching sounds that seemed too loud in all that stillness. I found the trail again. It was narrow and dark, covered in layers of pine needles that looked as if no one had walked there in years. I hesitated, looking back at my truck sitting lonely on the road, but then I stepped onto the trail. The trees crowded close. Branches brushed my shoulders. Every few minutes I heard small faint noises, maybe squirrels or birds, but they didn't sound normal. They were too sharp or too quick, like they stopped the moment I tried to listen closely. After about 10 minutes of walking, I saw a square shape deeper in the woods. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. It sat slightly tilted, as if the ground beneath one corner had softened over time. The wood was gray and split, and the windows were clouded with grime. The roof sagged in the middle. It wasn't big, maybe a single room and a tiny back area. I didn't want to go inside, but the cold was growing sharper by the minute, and the wind carried a damp smell that warned of more snow. I pushed open the warped door. It scraped across the floor with a heavy grinding sound. The smell hit me first. Dust, mold, and something metallic, like old tools left in a bucket of water. The cabin was darker inside than I expected. My flashlight beam cut across scattered debris, broken planks, and an old iron stove in the corner. There was no furniture except a collapsed table leaning against the wall. The floor dipped near the far side where the boards looked rotted. I stepped in cautiously, checking the corners, making sure no animals had taken shelter there. The air felt heavier inside, colder than outside even though there was no wind. I told myself it was just the shade and the thick walls trapping the chill. As I moved my light around, I noticed marks on the floor. At first they looked like scratches, but when I crouched closer, I saw they were drag marks. Long streaks cutting through the dust. They led from the doorway toward the back of the cabin, disappearing below the broken table. The dust was disturbed, but the pattern looked old. I tried to ignore how strange it looked and told myself animals had dragged something over the floor at some point. I nudged the broken table aside with my foot. It scraped loudly, and the sound echoed through the silent cabin in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. Underneath the table, I saw a trapdoor. Its edges were dark, and the wood around it was cracked. A rusted metal ring was bolted to the center. I didn't want to open it. Everything in me told me to leave it alone, turn around, and get out of there. But I also felt like ignoring it would keep me thinking about it later, imagining something worse than what was actually there. Curiosity mixed with that cold fear in my chest. I grabbed the ring with both hands and pulled. The wood creaked as the door lifted, flakes of dust drifting into the air. A dark square opening yawned beneath me. I shined the flashlight down. The beam landed on a small cellar, barely tall enough for someone to crouch in. The walls were made of stone, uneven and damp. There was old shelving on one side with jars so cloudy I couldn't see what was inside. But the thing that made my skin crawl was the worn path in the dirt, circling the small space as if someone had paced down there for a long time. The dirt looked packed and smooth, different from the rest of the cellar floor. A strange feeling hit me then, a mix of dread and the sense that I shouldn't be standing there, not even by accident. I lowered the door slowly and stepped back. The air felt tighter, like the cabin had closed around me. I decided I had seen enough. Whatever this place was, it wasn't somewhere I wanted to wait out the evening. I turned toward the door, already picturing myself walking back to my truck and maybe sleeping in the cab with extra blankets until morning. When I stepped outside, the temperature had dropped more than I expected. The sky was darker too, heavy clouds rolling in. I started down the trail quickly, but after only a minute of walking, I heard a sound behind me. Not an animal, not the wind. It was something soft dragging across the forest floor. I kept walking, trying not to look back, but the sound grew closer. The steps were uneven, like whoever or whatever was behind me was moving with difficulty. My throat tightened. I forced myself not to run. Running in the forest is how people fall, twist ankles, or hit their head on a low branch. After another 30 seconds, the noise stopped. The silence that rushed in after it felt worse than the sound itself. I finally turned. The trail behind me was empty, but the trees looked slightly off, as if something had been standing there and then stepped away at the last second. Pine needles were scattered on the dirt in a fresh, disturbed pattern. I walked faster, the flashlight bouncing in my shaking hand. I started hearing faint breathing sounds behind me, then silence, then breathing again. Soft, inconsistent, like someone trying to stay quiet and failing. The moment I saw my truck through the branches, I felt a rush of cold relief. I stepped out onto the road and hurried toward it. My boots slipped in the damp dirt. As I reached the door, I heard a steady, slow sound from behind me. Footsteps on the road, not the trail. I didn't look. I opened the truck door, climbed inside, and slammed it shut. My hands shook as I turned the key. The engine coughed, struggling, but then roared to life. I didn't wait for the heater. I put the truck in gear and drove forward, gravel spitting from the tires. As I sped down the road, I forced myself to look in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I saw a figure stepping back into the tree line. It moved stiffly, like its joints didn't work right, and its clothes hung loosely as if they didn't fit. The figure disappeared into the shadows. I didn't slow down again until I reached a gas station miles away. My heart was still hammering, and my hands were still shaking. The next day, when I returned with a tow truck, I told the driver I had left my truck on the side of the road because it overheated. I didn't mention the cabin. When we passed the area where I had parked, I looked for the trail. I shouldn't have been able to see it from the road, but I still expected it to be there. It wasn't. There was no trail, just thick pine trees and untouched ground, like nothing had ever been carved through that part of the forest at all. I never found that cabin again, and I never took those back roads after dark again. Whatever I saw or heard out there was real, and it didn't want to be found. I never thought a weekend in the woods could turn into something I'd never forget, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. It was October 1987, and I was 31, tired of the city noise, of the endless stream of work and responsibilities, craving nothing more than silence. I'd planned a hunting trip alone in northern Montana, somewhere deep in the Bitterroot Range. I'd booked a small, remote hunting cabin through an old connection my uncle had with a local outfitter, a man named Harris who swore it was the perfect spot for deer hunting and escaping the world. The drive up was long and slow. My Jeep rattled over the dirt roads that twisted through thick pine forests. Leaves were turning, a mix of gold, red, and brown, and the smell of damp earth was strong after the morning frost. I carried only what I could pack into my back: hunting rifle, some canned food, a lantern, matches, a couple of blankets, and enough water for 3 days. When I finally saw the cabin, I realized how isolated it really was. It was small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney, a rusted metal roof, and a front porch that sagged under the weight of years. There was no power, no phone, nothing but the trees around it. A dirt trail led down to a narrow creek where I could refill my water, and a small clearing surrounded the cabin. A few hundred yards past that, the forest rose sharply into hills. It was beautiful, quiet, and untouched, exactly what I wanted. The first day was normal. I unpacked, checked the rifle, and walked the surrounding area, marking a few spots where deer tracks were fresh. I set up a small fire outside the cabin to cook some beans and bread, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't known in years. My only companion was my German shepherd, Brutus, who trailed close behind, sniffing everything with the careful curiosity only a hunting dog could have. That night, I slept fitfully. The cabin creaked as the wind shook the surrounding trees. Brutus slept near my feet, ears twitching at every sound. I thought nothing of it at first, but around 2 in the morning, I heard a snapping of a branch outside. The kind of snap that sounds deliberate. I froze. My first thought was another hunter, maybe someone lost in the dark. But the area was so remote that the nearest cabin besides mine was miles away. Brutus growled softly, low and warning. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped onto the porch, shining the light into the dark woods. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and the blackness beyond. I told myself it was probably a deer or a fox, I went back inside, heart still pounding, and tried to sleep again. But the night stretched on, long and uneasy. Around 3, I heard it again. A rustling, a low thud from the back of the cabin. This time Brutus barked sharply, running to the back door. I grabbed the rifle again, loaded it, and crept toward the back. The sound was closer now, like something heavy brushing against the cabin walls. I turned the corner and froze. There was a figure, not human, not exactly, but standing upright, hunched slightly, moving carefully through the shadows. Its face was hidden by the darkness, but it had the wrong proportions. Long limbs, wide shoulders, and hands that seemed too long, too skeletal. It wasn't moving fast, but it was deliberate. My first thought was a man, maybe a hunter gone mad. But there was something in its movement that didn't match any human I'd ever seen. Brutus barked again, and the figure froze for a second, then disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I kept the rifle close, flashlight ready, and every time I heard a rustle, I tensed. The first light of dawn brought relief, and I convinced myself it had been a deer or some trick of the shadows. I took Brutus and walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for footprints or any sign of someone else. There were tracks, too large for a deer, spaced widely like someone or something was striding through. I couldn't explain them. The next day I stayed inside mostly, chopping firewood, keeping a careful watch through the windows. I noticed things were moved slightly when I returned from the creek. A blanket on the porch shifted. Some of my cans nudged. Nothing that could prove someone had been there, but enough to make my stomach tighten. That night, I double-checked the locks on the cabin doors, even though they were just old sliding latches. I put Brutus on a leash to sleep near the door. Around midnight, the sounds returned. This time, it wasn't outside, it was on the roof. Heavy thumps, dragging noises, the scraping of claws against metal. Brutus barked furiously, straining against his leash. My adrenaline spiked. I climbed the stairs to the loft, scanning with the flashlight. Shadows danced on the walls. Then I saw it again, just at the edge of the tree line. A tall, dark shape, perfectly still, watching. I could feel its gaze, heavy and deliberate. I realized then that whatever it wasn't here to play. It was studying me, waiting, learning. I stayed awake the rest of the night, rifle in hand, sweating through my jacket despite the cold. By morning, I decided I wasn't staying. I packed everything I could carry, leaving only the firewood and some broken branches as cover. I didn't dare leave Brutus behind. He stayed glued to my side, ears alert, eyes scanning constantly. The hike out was tense. Every sound made me flinch, every shadow seemed to move. I kept off the main trail, using the compass and the sun to navigate back toward the dirt road. At one point, I thought I saw it again, a movement behind the trees, but when I turned, nothing was there. I didn't stop. My heart was racing, and my mind was focused only on getting back to civilization. Finally, around late afternoon, I reached the Jeep. Relief washed over me, but I didn't relax until I had driven far down the road, the trees thinning, the mountains shrinking behind me. Brutus lay in the passenger seat, exhausted but alert. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station to report what I'd seen, but no one took me seriously. They said it could have been a bear, or just my imagination after being alone in the woods too long. I didn't argue. I just wanted to get home. I never went back to that cabin. The thought of it, the way the figure moved, how deliberate it had been, it stayed with me. I told no one the full story, not even my closest friends. Some part of me knew that if it had followed me out, if I hadn't been careful, it might have ended differently. And sometimes, even now, I still see shadows out of the corner of my eye when I'm in the woods. I know what I saw was real, and I know somewhere out there, whatever it was, it's still watching, still waiting. And I'll never forget the silence of that cabin, the cold weight of fear in the air, and the feeling that I was not alone in the woods, not for a single moment. It was the autumn of 1998, in a part of northern Maine that I had barely seen before. The kind of place where the roads end and all that's left are unpaved tracks cutting through thick forest. I was 26, alone, and determined to finally build something of my own. A small cabin far from the noise of the town I had left behind. The decision had been impulsive, but my mind had been restless for months, craving silence and the slow rhythm of working with my hands. I found the spot after a long drive on a muddy, barely visible road that wound its way through pine and birch. The clearing was small, barely enough for the cabin, but it overlooked a shallow stream that hummed quietly over rocks, a sound that felt calming under the thick canopy of clouds. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the sky was a uniform gray, thick and heavy, hinting at rain. I started by laying a foundation, using rough stones I found nearby and cement I carried in a wheelbarrow from the main road. The work was grueling. My hands were blistered, my back ached constantly, and the rain began to fall in fits, turning the soil into sticky mud that clung to my boots. I didn't mind. There was something grounding about the rain pounding against the half-built walls, the sound a steady companion as I hammered and sawed. I used rough-cut pine logs for the walls. They were not polished, not neat, just solid, practical. I spent hours each day fitting them together, trimming uneven edges, forcing stubborn logs into place. By midweek, the walls were up to my chest, and I started on the roof. The shingles were old, reclaimed from a barn I had passed on the way here. They were brittle, some cracked in half as I nailed them into place, but slowly the structure began to feel like a cabin, like something I could live in, even if it was just temporary. Nights were the worst. The wind whipped through the trees, shaking branches against the roof, sending showers of water through the gaps in the logs I hadn't fully sealed yet. I learned quickly which patches needed more tar or moss to keep out the drafts. One night, I woke to the sound of a particularly violent storm. Rain hammered the roof in heavy sheets, and the wind howled like it had teeth. The cabin creaked under the strain. I pressed my back against one of the walls and just listened, counting the seconds between crashes of thunder, trying to remind myself that the noise was nothing more than weather, that the cabin wasn't about to fall down. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. There was a rhythm to the work that kept my mind occupied. I carried water from the stream in buckets, chopped firewood until my arms ached, and patched the gaps in the walls with mud and moss. I even built a small wood stove, the chimney crooked and smoking, but functional. By the second week, I could sleep inside without waking up drenched. The scent of wet pine and burning wood became familiar, comforting in its own raw, earthy way. It was on a particularly dark night, maybe the third week, when things got tense. The rain had been relentless for hours, and the wind had risen to a shrieking pitch. I had lit the stove, and the cabin was warm and dry, the fire crackling on the metal grate. Outside, the forest was nearly invisible, just shadows shifting in the storm. Then I heard it, a low, wet crunching sound, like heavy boots trudging through mud. At first, I froze, telling myself it was the wind or a tree branch falling. But then it came again, closer, deliberate. I grabbed a lantern and walked to the small window I had installed. The glass was streaked with rain, but I could just make out the silhouette of a man moving slowly through the mud, inches from the cabin. My heart sank. I had expected isolation, sure, but I hadn't expected company like this. Someone walking through the forest in a storm, in the middle of nowhere, without a road. I ducked behind the wall, grabbed the largest piece of firewood I had split earlier, and waited. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I could hear him breathing, heavy and uneven. My mind raced. I had no phone, no neighbors for miles. All I had was the cabin, my firewood, and my own 2 hands. I stayed hidden, tense, counting the seconds, until I heard something shift in the mud and the man started moving again. His steps were clumsy, almost drunk, until finally, he stumbled and fell with a wet thud. The sound of him struggling to rise and curse under his breath echoed in the night. I didn't move. By dawn, he was gone. The ground was churned up where he had stumbled, footprints sunk deep in the wet earth, leading back toward the trees. I walked outside after the storm had passed, inspected the marks, and felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He hadn't found me, hadn't knocked or shouted or tried to break in, but the encounter left my nerves raw. I spent the rest of the day reinforcing the cabin, adding thicker mud to the walls, extra logs, and a small wooden barrier in front of the door. I didn't want anyone, no matter the circumstance, to have an easy way in. After that, the nights felt quieter, though the forest seemed to have shifted. I paid attention to every sound, every branch snap, every puddle splash. The rain continued for days, relentless, but I had learned to live with it. I even began to enjoy it. The way it made the wood smell richer, how it polished the logs in a soft, natural sheen, how it blurred the forest into something private, my own world. By the 4th week, the cabin was finished. Not perfect, certainly not pretty, but solid. The roof held, the walls stood straight, the stove worked. I lit a fire that night, poured water from the stream into a kettle, and watched the smoke curl into the rainy sky. For the first time, I felt a calm certainty. I had made something here, a shelter, a place to survive, to be alone if I wanted, to feel at home even in the raw, indifferent forest. I realized then that the fear I had felt during the storm, seeing the stranger in the mud, wasn't just about being alone. It was about being vulnerable, exposed in a world that didn't care. But building the cabin, facing the storm, enduring the nights had changed that. I could be vulnerable and still survive. I could carve out my own safety, even in the middle of nowhere. The rain finally eased, leaving the forest dripping and sparkling in early morning light. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting shafts of pale gold over the wet ground. I sat on the stoop with a cup of steaming coffee, listening to the stream and the wind in the treetops, feeling a deep, steady relief. The cabin was mine, the forest was mine to navigate, and the storm, as terrible as it had been, had passed. I had endured it all, and I had built something lasting from it. That night, I slept deeply, the wind still whispering outside but no longer menacing. When I woke, the forest was calm, and I felt ready for whatever came next. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was proof that I could face fear, work through it, and emerge stronger. And in that, there was a quiet satisfaction, a kind of happiness I had never known in the city, a sense of being truly grounded in the world. I remember the trip like it happened yesterday, even though it was 5 years ago. I was 32 then, and my dog, Max, a German shepherd with a calm temperament and sharp instincts, had been my only companion for years. After a particularly draining few months at work, I decided to take a solo trip to a small cabin I found listed online. It was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from the main roads, with no cell service and a promise of complete isolation. I needed that. Max, of course, was coming with me. The drive was long and monotonous, the kind of winding road that made you feel cut off from the world entirely. I remember how the forest seemed to stretch endlessly on both sides, dense with pine and birch, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The GPS signal dropped long before I reached the cabin, leaving me with nothing but a vague sense of direction and a printed map I had prepared. When I finally pulled into the narrow, gravel path leading to the cabin, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky with deep oranges and reds. The cabin itself was small, maybe 30 feet by 20, built from old logs that had darkened over time. There was a thin chimney rising from the roof and a small porch that looked like it hadn't been used in a long while. Max jumped out of the car immediately, sniffing the air and circling the perimeter with that quiet intensity he always had when he sensed something off. Inside, the cabin was rustic but livable. There was a small wood stove, a basic kitchen area, and 2 bedrooms. Dust coated everything, and there was that unmistakable smell of wood and decay. I unpacked the essentials, stacked some firewood near the stove, and let Max explore the inside. He seemed unusually tense, his ears pricked and his body low, though I tried to brush it off as him being curious about the new environment. The first night passed quietly. I built a fire, cooked some canned beans, and read by the dim light. Max slept at my feet, his deep breathing a comfort. But it was the second night that started to unravel the illusion of peace. I had gone to bed later than usual. The wind had picked up outside, whistling through the gaps in the logs. I was dozing when I felt Max stiffen beside me. He growled low in his throat, a sound I had never heard directed at nothing. I froze, listening. Then came the noise. It was subtle at first, a soft scrape against the wooden floorboards of the cabin. I convinced myself it was the wind, an animal outside, maybe a raccoon or deer, until I heard it again, closer, as if something was moving along the porch. I grabbed a flashlight and swung it across the room. The beam cut through the darkness, catching only Max, who was now fully alert, hackles raised. I could see his body trembling, a mix of fear and readiness. I went to the window and shined the light outside. Nothing, just shadows of the trees swaying violently in the gusts. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the cabin and every whisper of wind kept me on edge. Around 3 in the morning, Max barked sharply, not the playful bark he had at home, but a warning, urgent and unrelenting. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a heavy flashlight, and slowly opened the cabin door. The air was cold and wet, the moon casting a weak light over the forest floor. Max bolted out ahead of me, nose to the ground, growling low. I followed him, the gravel crunching under my boots. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Large, muddy, and unmistakably human. They led from the edge of the treeline straight to the cabin, then stopped at the porch as if whoever or whatever had come had paused there to watch. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that someone had been hiding in the woods, watching me, maybe planning to wait until I was asleep. I ran back inside, locked the door, and checked every window. Max circled constantly, growling at the walls. My phone had no signal, my maps were useless, and the nearest neighbor was over 2 miles away. Panic began to rise in my chest, a tight, icy weight that made it hard to breathe. I realized then that I had underestimated the isolation. The rest of that night passed in a blur of tension. Every shadow, every gust of wind made me flinch. Max stayed close, moving with a fluid alertness that made me both comforted and terrified. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, expecting to see evidence of someone hiding. Instead, I found the footprints had vanished. No sign of them leading away from the cabin. Nothing but the forest, silent and indifferent. I spent the day reinforcing the doors, nailing boards over weak windows, and preparing myself to leave if necessary. But the forest felt alive in ways I couldn't explain. Every bird call seemed sharp and frantic. Every snap of a twig echoed unnaturally. Max refused to leave the cabin's perimeter, barking at empty space, ears swiveling toward unseen sounds. The third night was the worst. Around midnight, a different sound reached me. Slow, deliberate thumps against the walls, as if someone was testing the structure, checking for weaknesses. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The thumps stopped suddenly, and then a silence so deep it pressed against my ears. I couldn't tell if it was waiting or gone. Hours passed like that, with Max growling at intervals, hair raised, ready to protect. By morning, I had decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed the essentials quietly, Max never leaving my side. As we left, I noticed something in the dirt near the driveway. A single, clear footprint, larger than mine, pressed into the soil. No other sign of anyone, just that one imprint, staring back at me as if the forest itself had left it as a warning. The drive back was nerve-wracking. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. Max remained alert, occasionally barking at shadows passing the trees, his instincts never wrong. When I finally reached the paved road, the sense of isolation lifted, replaced by relief and exhaustion. That cabin, and the nights spent with Max alert and unyielding by my side, left a permanent mark on me. It was not ghosts or fairy tales that terrified me, but the raw reality of isolation and the unknown. The forest hides things that are patient and unseen. Humans are not always the only danger, but the possibility of being watched, tracked, and vulnerable leaves a weight that never fully lifts. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. But Max, he still reacts sharply whenever we drive past dense forests. Ears pricked, body tense, as if he remembers the nights when shadows moved just beyond our sight. And I remember too, in vivid, unrelenting detail, how it feels to be so completely alone, with nothing but a dog and the walls of a fragile cabin between you and whatever might be out there. I had been driving for nearly 10 hours straight, the sun already dipping behind the dense pines lining the winding backroads of northern Idaho. It was October of 1998, and the air was sharp with early winter's bite. My name is Daniel, I was 29 then, and I was alone except for my old German shepherd, Max. I had rented a small cabin for the week, tucked miles away from the nearest town. My goal was simple: escape the city, escape the noise, and spend some time alone in the woods. I'd done this kind of trip before, but something about this particular stretch of forest felt heavier. The road narrowed, gravel crunching under the tires as I turned onto a dirt track that led deeper into the forest. The GPS signal was weak. At some point, it simply stopped updating. I didn't mind. I liked the isolation, the sense of being off the map. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected, built of rough-hewn logs, smoke curling from a stone chimney. There was a clearing around it, maybe an acre wide, surrounded by tall firs that swayed gently in the wind. I parked, letting Max out first. His paws sank slightly in the damp dirt, and he sniffed everything, ears alert. I unloaded the car and carried in my bag and a small cooler. The cabin had a single room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, a table, a single bed, and a tiny bathroom. The furniture was basic, worn but functional. I lit the stove, stacked some logs, and started making a simple dinner. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost unnervingly so. No birds, no rustle of small animals, just the wind through the trees. That first night, I tried to relax, telling myself that the quiet was what I came for. Max lay beside the bed, ears twitching occasionally. I had a lantern on the table, and I read a few pages of a book before sleep overtook me. But sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up. My instincts were screaming at me before my eyes even opened. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking around the cabin, the crunch of boots or heavy shoes against dirt and gravel. My stomach dropped. I froze, listening. Max growled low, rolling slightly onto his side but still alert. The noise stopped after a few seconds. Then silence. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a dream, but my body refused to relax. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window. Outside, the forest was black, the shadows stretching like fingers. There was no one there, no footprints in the dirt, nothing. I shook my head, telling myself the wind or some small animal had made the noise, but sleep didn't come after that. The next day, I tried to ignore the tension. I chopped some firewood and walked a few hundred yards into the forest with Max, trying to convince myself that everything was normal. The trees were dense, the air crisp, and the sun occasionally broke through the canopy. I collected a few fallen branches to burn later and noticed how quiet it was, how the forest seemed to hold its breath. There were no birds, no rustling, only the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. By nightfall, unease had settled in my chest. I locked the door even though it had a simple latch. I triple-checked the windows. Max seemed nervous too, pacing the floor, ears perked toward every shadow. That night, I kept the stove burning for warmth and the flashlight on the table. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the crunch of boots outside. This time, I could tell it was deliberate. Someone was walking around the cabin slowly, circling. My heart pounded. I grabbed the old hunting rifle I had brought along and quietly loaded it, every instinct screaming at me to stay quiet. The noise stopped again. Then, a sudden knock. Not a loud pounding, just a sharp, deliberate tap on the door. My hands went cold. I stayed perfectly still, my breathing shallow, waiting. Max growled, low and menacing now. Another knock, this time louder. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. My mind raced. There was no one else for miles. No one could just wander in here unnoticed. Whoever it was must have been watching me for some time. I waited. I didn't call out, didn't make a sound. After maybe 10 minutes, the knocking stopped, and the forest went quiet again. I sat in the dark with the rifle across my lap, Max pressed against my leg, shaking slightly. I stayed awake the rest of the night, every noise making me flinch. The next morning, I didn't leave the cabin. Instead, I examined the perimeter. There were faint tracks around the cabin, too small for a deer, too large for a dog. Human tracks. They weren't deep, meaning whoever had been there wasn't carrying much weight, maybe moving quickly or carefully. Whoever it was, they had been closer than I wanted to imagine. My heart sank. I realized that being alone in the woods was no longer a choice. It had become a risk. I spent the day preparing for another night. I reinforced the door with a fallen log I dragged against it, stacked more wood near the windows so I could barricade if needed, and made sure my phone had signal, though it was still spotty at best. I rationed my food and water carefully. I made Max stay close to me, and I didn't leave the cabin again until the sun was high enough that I could see the forest clearly. Night 3 was the worst. Around 1 a.m., I heard them again, walking in circles, stopping, circling again. And then I heard whispering, low and almost indecipherable, just outside the cabin. My stomach turned. Whoever it was had gotten bolder, and they were close enough that I could hear the crunch of their breath or the scrape of fabric against bark. I stayed in the corner, behind the stove, with Max pressed against me, rifle ready. Hours passed like that, the whispering fading in and out with the wind. Eventually, just before dawn, everything went quiet. When the first light hit the trees, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything quickly, loading the car while keeping a constant watch on the forest. Max refused to leave my side. I drove slowly back to the main road, scanning the woods constantly. I didn't see anyone, but I knew they had been there, waiting for me. The tracks were gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't go back to that cabin. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, who came by a week later to check it out. They found nothing, no tracks, no signs of trespassing, but I knew what I had heard. Whoever had been there had vanished, leaving no trace but fear. Even years later, I still think about that cabin, about those nights. about the silence that wasn't natural and the deliberate knocking at the door. I never returned to northern Idaho alone. Max passed years later, but I still remember him pressing against me that night, ears twitching, growling at something I couldn't see. I tell the story to friends sometimes, and they laugh it off as imagination, stress, or isolation messing with my head. Maybe they're right. Maybe the mind plays tricks when you're alone in the forest. But I know what I felt, what I heard. And I know that some people or something can be patient, silent, and terrifyingly close, even when the world seems empty. That experience changed me. I learned that nature can be beautiful, but it can also hide dangers that aren't obvious. Not bears, not wolves, but humans. People with unknown intentions, watching, waiting. And I learned that survival isn't about bravery or luck. It's about preparation, observation, and trusting your instincts when every sound, every shadow, and every whisper makes your heart pound. I never went back, but I still drive past the area sometimes, looking at the trees, the winding roads, the hidden clearings. I think about the cabin, and I wonder if whoever it was is still out there somewhere, waiting for the next person who thinks being alone in the woods is safe. It was the summer of 1997, and I was a young park ranger, barely 24, fresh out of training, stationed in the dense wilderness of northern Montana. The forest was ancient here, thick with towering pines and interspersed with patches of birch and cedar, their bark slick from constant rain. I had been assigned to a remote ranger cabin near the edge of a small, seldom visited trail that wound its way around a secluded lake. The cabin was old, built in the 1950s, with weathered logs and a rusted tin roof that clanged when the wind picked up. I had come here alone for a 2-week monitoring shift, tasked with checking wildlife movements, maintaining trail markers, and ensuring that no one ventured off-limits into the more dangerous areas. The first few days were uneventful, almost peaceful. Mornings were spent walking the trails, cataloging signs of deer, elk, and the occasional bear tracks. I'd often hear the distant cry of a hawk or the low rumble of a river hidden beneath the trees. The evenings were quiet, save for the wind whispering through the branches and the occasional owl calling. The cabin itself was small, with one main room, a loft where I slept, a tiny kitchen, and a wood stove that was essential for warmth at night. Its walls were lined with shelves holding old maps, weathered ranger manuals, and the occasional leftover can of beans or soup from previous rangers. On the fourth night, the weather changed. A storm had been brewing all afternoon, dark clouds gathering over the treetops, the kind that makes the forest feel like it's holding its breath. By evening, heavy rain pelted the roof in a relentless rhythm, and gusts of wind rattled the cabin's thin windows. I had just finished securing my food supplies in the bear locker outside when I noticed something strange. A faint light flickering through the rain beyond the treeline. At first, I thought it was a reflection of the storm, maybe lightning catching on wet leaves, but the flashes were steady, like a small lantern. I didn't see anyone on the trail, and the lake was hidden behind a thick grove of spruce. My first instinct was to ignore it. Visitors weren't supposed to be here, but unease settled in my chest. I made sure all doors were locked and checked the windows again. Everything seemed normal. Still, the flashes continued, subtle but unmistakable. By midnight, the wind had picked up even more, bending the pines almost horizontally, and the rain sounded like bullets on the roof. That's when I heard it. A soft but deliberate crunching from the trail that led to the cabin. Footsteps, careful, slow, measured. I froze, listening. The sound stopped suddenly, then shifted as if someone was circling the cabin. My heart rate spiked. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the stove, standard issue for rangers in bear country, and moved to the window. The rain was heavy enough that visibility was low, but I could just make out shapes moving between the trees, something tall, perhaps two people, but it was hard to tell. The storm seemed endless. Every gust of wind made the cabin groan. Every crack of a branch outside sounded like someone trying to force their way in. I stayed by the window until exhaustion set in, eventually convincing myself I'd imagined it. The forest played tricks on the mind during storms. I went to bed in the loft, rifle beside me, and tried to sleep. I woke hours later to a new sound. Something scraping against the cabin's outer wall. A slow, deliberate scratching. My stomach turned. Whoever or whatever it was right outside. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The scratching stopped. Then the sound of footsteps retreated into the woods. I waited, tense, until dawn, the storm finally easing. When I finally stepped outside, the forest looked deceptively peaceful. But the ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, large and muddy, circled the cabin. Not animal tracks, human, heavy boots. I followed them, tracing them toward the lake trail, but they vanished near a stand of fir trees. No one had come through the main trailhead, which meant they must have snuck in from the far side of the lake, an area almost impossible to reach on foot, especially in a storm. The next day, I checked the trail cameras I had set up. One of the cameras facing the lake had caught something. A figure, barely visible through the sheets of rain, crouched near the edge of the forest. Their face was obscured, and they moved cautiously, almost stalking. It wasn't wildlife. It wasn't hikers. And judging by the size and posture, it was deliberate, someone familiar with moving quietly through the forest. I stayed inside the cabin that night. The storm had cleared, but a heavy fog rolled in from the lake, and the forest was thick with mist. I sat by the stove, keeping the rifle close. Around 11 p.m., the crunching returned, this time accompanied by the sound of snapping branches deeper in the woods. It wasn't random. It was calculated, like someone following the trail I had walked earlier in the day. Hours passed. I never saw them, but their presence was undeniable. By early morning, the fog had lifted, and sunlight filtered weakly through the trees. I left the cabin cautiously, checking the perimeter. There was no one and no sign of forced entry. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, as though the forest itself had shifted to accommodate an unseen presence. I reported everything to the park headquarters. They investigated, sending a team by helicopter and on foot, but they found nothing. No campsites, no footprints beyond what I had documented, no evidence of intruders. The ranger who followed up told me it could have been poachers, people who had been in the area for months and knew the terrain well. It made sense, but it didn't ease the memory of that stormy night and the deliberate way someone had stalked around the cabin. By the end of my shift, I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I had double-checked every lock, every window, every corner of the cabin before leaving. As I walked the trail back toward the ranger station, the forest seemed lighter, almost normal again, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, not for hunting, but for something else entirely. Testing boundaries, perhaps, or simply asserting that this wilderness was theirs as much as anyone's. Years later, I still remember that cabin. I remember the way the storm sounded on the tin roof, the way the shadows moved in the trees, and the cold certainty that someone had been close enough to touch the cabin walls. But the forest had survived, the cabin had stood, and I had survived too. I returned to the ranger service for decades, working in other areas, but I never again felt as vulnerable as I did that summer in northern Montana. That experience taught me a truth about the wilderness. It's not just animals and weather that make it dangerous. Sometimes, the most frightening presence is another human being, hidden in plain sight, patient and deliberate, waiting for the perfect moment. And that realization has stayed with me, etched into my memory as sharply as the wind that rattled the old cabin roof that night. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like that, in the middle of nowhere, with only the walls of a creaking old cabin between me and something that didn't belong. It was late November of 2009, and I had decided to escape the city for a while, craving the silence of the remote mountains of northern Arizona. I was 28, tired of office life, and wanted a break from people. I didn't want anyone around, just me and my dog, Max, a German Shepherd mix who had a knack for sensing danger before I even noticed it. The cabin I rented was a small, run-down thing, made of dark cedar that had weathered decades of snow and wind. It sat on a ridge far off the dirt road that led from the nearest town, maybe 10 miles away, surrounded by forest on all sides. When I arrived, the air was already cold, sharp with the scent of pine and wet earth. I parked my truck, hauled in my few bags, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. So quiet it made my ears ring. I thought that was part of the charm. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stone hearth and settled into the worn recliner by the window. Max lay at my feet, his ears twitching at every crack of the fire and the occasional snap of a distant branch. I remember watching shadows move among the trees, small shapes that I assumed were raccoons or deer. I felt isolated but comfortable, exactly what I wanted. The second night, something changed. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a noise that made my stomach twist. A faint scratching, almost like claws dragging across wood. I froze, listening. Max's growl started low in his throat, rumbling steadily, his body stiff. I told myself it was a coyote or some wild animal, probably just trying to find shelter from the cold. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was nothing. By the third night, the noises had escalated. It started with footsteps outside the cabin, careful and deliberate, circling the perimeter. I checked all the locks, even though the cabin was supposed to be secure. Windows were shut, doors bolted, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. Max wouldn't leave my side, and he wouldn't stop growling. What unsettled me most was that the sounds didn't match any animal I knew. The steps were heavy, but sometimes they moved with unnatural speed, like they could leap through the trees silently. It was on the fourth night that I saw it. I had gotten up to refill my water jug when a movement outside the window caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a deer because it was large and seemed to move on four legs, but the way it moved was wrong. Too fluid, too precise. It twisted and turned its body in ways no deer could, and when it lifted its head, I froze. Its face, it wasn't a normal animal's face. The eyes were almost human, a dull amber glow reflecting in the firelight from inside the cabin. Max barked violently, and I yanked him back from the window. The creature froze for a moment, then vanished into the dark trees as quickly as it had appeared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair with Max pressed against my chest, listening to the wind and the faint sound of branches snapping. Every time I thought I heard the creature coming back, Max stiffened and growled. I realized then that this was not a wild animal. It was intelligent in a way that scared me more than anything else I had ever faced. Over the next few nights, it became bolder. It would appear at odd times, always just outside the line of the porch light, sometimes crouched low like it was stalking prey, sometimes standing upright, blending unervingly into the trees. I tried to leave. I thought about driving to town, but the truck was parked down a slope, and the dirt road was slick with rain and mud. Any attempt to leave would be visible, and I had the overwhelming feeling that it was waiting for me, calculating, patient. One night, around midnight, I heard it move directly behind the cabin. The back door, which I had double-checked and bolted, shook slightly, like someone was leaning against it, testing it. I could hear its breathing through the thin wood. My hands shook as I grabbed the fire poker, pressing it against my chest like it could protect me from something that didn't belong in the natural world. Max was growling, hair bristled, lips curled back to show teeth. Then it stopped. Silence. the kind of silence that presses down on your lungs, making it hard to breathe. I realized I couldn't stay inside forever, couldn't leave at night. I had to be smart. I decided to spend the next day preparing, boarding up windows with spare planks, moving heavy furniture in front of the doors. I gathered all the knives I could find and kept a flashlight and my old rifle nearby. Max and I spent the day quietly, ears straining at every rustle of the wind or tree branch. I didn't leave the cabin until I felt fully ready for whatever it was. That night, it came again. I heard it first as a faint rustling near the woods, then footsteps. I shined the flashlight out the window and saw it crouched low, watching the cabin, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I raised the rifle, but I didn't fire. Something about this creature, shooting it without knowing what it was, seemed like a mistake. I realized then that it wasn't here for sport. It was hunting, studying, waiting for me to make the first move. Hours passed. I stayed awake, not daring to sleep, watching the faint shadows move outside. By dawn, it had vanished. I stepped outside cautiously, Max at my side. The snow had started falling, covering tracks, masking its path. I searched the perimeter carefully, noting deep, strangely shaped footprints that were too large to be a human and too elongated for any wolf or coyote. My stomach sank. Whatever it was, it had been here, observing, learning. After that, I stayed in the cabin a few more days, waiting for it to leave. I didn't see it again, but I knew it was still out there. When I finally left, I drove slowly down the dirt road, Max alert beside me, scanning the trees for any movement. I didn't look back, not once. Even when I reached the paved highway and felt safe among cars and people, a part of me knew it had been following me, or at least it could have been. Years later, I told myself it was a predator, a human maybe, practicing something cruel in the wilderness. I never had proof and I never wanted to, but Max never forgot either. He would growl at empty shadows, ears high, eyes scanning corners. And every time I pass a remote forest now, I remember the weight of those amber eyes in the night, the silent patience of something that watches and waits, and I feel the cold dread of knowing there are places where something waits just out of sight, learning, hunting, and patient beyond reason. I never went back to cabins. I never wanted to, and I never told anyone where exactly I had been because I wasn't sure they would believe me, and I wasn't sure I wanted them to.